Order. Elliot Coburn to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I beg to move that this House has considered LGBT Plus History Month, which fell in the month of February. And as co-chair of the APPG on global LGBT plus rights, which I'm delighted to co-chair with the Right Honourable Member for Wallasey, I want to thank the Backbench Business Committee for allowing time for us to discuss this topic today. And it has indeed become something of an annual debate, so I don't want to repeat too much of what we have said before. But having looked through Hansard at some of the records of our previous debates on this topic, it is a shame that we do have to repeat actually quite a lot of what has been said about what we need to do here in the UK and indeed around the world to further advance the rights of LGBT plus people in this country and worldwide. Because I do want to stress the point, which we've made a number of occasions now, I think, as colleagues in this place, that LGBT plus people have always existed. We haven't just popped out of the ground in the 60s and 70s and started marching through London and the streets of our cities. And I do worry about that sometimes, particularly when we talk about the rhetoric around trans people that has developed over the last few years. And I remember us having a discussion during the conversion therapy debate last Friday when one colleague justified not supporting taking that bill through to committee by saying, well, you know, we just never saw anything about trans people when we were younger. Well, of course not. They weren't allowed to be public. We were legislated as LGBT plus people to stay in the closet. The laws did not allow us to be open and to be free. So, of course, we didn't have the ability to be open and free as we are today. So I think that's a bit of a ridiculous argument. But I would like to begin even by talking about some of the positive steps that have been taken around the world since we've last held this debate. And the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans and Intersex Association, ILGA, maintains a database of these laws around the world, which includes dashboards showing which countries criminalise same-sex acts and the charts showing decriminalisation year by year. Now, when we were here last year, we celebrated the fact that Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados and St Kitts and Nevis decriminalised same-sex acts. And in 2023, I'm delighted to report that the Cook Islands, Mauritius and Singapore joined their ranks. Same-sex marriage was legalised in the last 12 months in Andorra, Slovenia and Estonia. Same-sex civil unions have been proposed or passed in Latvia, Poland, Czechia, Hong Kong and parts of Japan. Conversion therapy bans have been proposed or passed in Portugal, Norway, Tasmania, in Australia, Switzerland and the Netherlands, and other laws to improve the lives of LGBT plus people, such as adoption rights, anti-discrimination laws, advances in the rights of trans people to gender recognition and others, have been passed in places like New Zealand, Colombia, Australia, Mexico, Cuba, Taiwan, Paraguay, Thailand, Iceland, Georgia, Italy, Cyprus, Germany, South Korea, Pakistan, and more. So there is much to be positive about, and we welcome that progress around the world. However, I think the point has been made by other colleagues in other debates, and I think is worth repeating. We cannot take progress for granted, and we cannot assume that these hard-fought-for rights, not just in these countries that I've mentioned so far, but indeed here in the UK as well, the hard-fought freedoms and the hard-fought rights that we have managed to achieve are not set in stone, that there is no chance of those ever being reversed. And we've already spoken in this House about some of the disgraceful measures that have been taken around the world to row back on the rights of LGBT plus people, such as Uganda's anti-homosexuality bill, and other African nations like Ghana looking worryingly close to doing the same. In fact, anti-LGBT plus laws have been passed or proposed in countries like Bulgaria, Bahrain, Russia, Belarus, Niger, Nigeria, Puerto Rico, Kenya, Hungary, Iraq, Lebanon, Malaysia, Oman, Jordan, and Burkina Faso. But there have also been worrying developments in countries where we would assume that progress was only heading forward, particularly Italy, Spain, and of course a huge swathe of state-level anti-LGBT laws in the USA. Now, LGBT plus rights have become increasingly politicised, and we can see that happening here in the UK as well. And we, of course, have made incredible progress, and I always want to champion the incredible progress we have made. In the last decade alone, we can talk about the successes of same-sex marriage, becoming a leading country in eradicating new HIV transmissions, LGBT content in RSC, and more. But of course, there is still a lot to do. And I'm afraid the Minister will not be surprised when I talk mainly about the need to make progress with banning conversion therapy. And I was incredibly disappointed that last week we did not manage to persuade the government, or indeed the House, to allow a very compromised bill, so well compromised, in fact, it wasn't necessarily universally welcomed by the LGBT plus community. But the fact that it wasn't even allowed to go through to committee stage so that we could thrash out some of those challenges and finally make progress towards banning these abhorrent practices was very disappointing indeed, and I will gladly give way.
The UK did not feature on any of the lists he mentioned apart from the last one, obviously. And wouldn't it be good, since we have a whole history month, for the government to come back to the table quickly with a conversion therapy bill?
I couldn't agree with the Honourable Member more on that point. And this particular bill we were debating last week was the product of extensive hard work and compromise, having met with people who were both sceptical and incredibly pro-banning these practices. And indeed, it did attract criticism from those who were in favour of those wanting to ban it because, for example, unlike other countries, like Norway, for example, it doesn't carry a jail sentence. But the bill was an attempt to try and bring everyone together, take the heat out of the debate and allow us to finally make some progress. However, that did not happen. The government wasn't keen to support it and it was spoken out. I'll gladly give way.
The honourable gentleman for giving way, because we both attended the debate last Friday, and was he as disappointed as I was that despite how modest the bill was, how reasonable it attempted to be, that some of the arguments against it were so unreasonable?
I absolutely agree with the Right Honourable Lady and the co-chair of the APPG. She's absolutely right. I think it demonstrates that, sadly, there will be those who, no matter how much engagement and how much compromise you make, they are not interested in banning these practices. They don't see a ban as necessary. In fact, they are against a ban because they believe it will infringe on certain rights. Now, I don't believe that argument for 1 minute. I think the only thing that banning conversion practices achieves is to stop people being subjected to harm that is still legal here in the United Kingdom at the moment. That is why we have to continue with the progress to ban it. Because there has been so many promises since the proposal was first made by the LGBT Action Plan in 2018, and yet we still haven't seen sign of a bill. Now, we're often told, oh, well, it's very complicated. Well, no one's saying that it's not complicated, but we did deliver Brexit faster than this, and I would argue that that was slightly more complex. We also aren't working from a blank slate. We have many other examples from around the world where this kind of legislation has been successfully enacted, hasn't had the chilling effect that we're often warned about in terms of infringements on the freedom of speech, on the rights of women, for example. That just simply hasn't happened in any example that I've looked at globally that has already passed such a ban. So we really have now had ample time to bring forward a bill. It's been promised in 2 Queen's speeches, it's been promised at the dispatch box, and yet there seems to always be a new reason to delay. And the latest that we've heard is that we are now waiting for the outcome of Dr. Cass's review into child and adolescent healthcare when it comes to treating people who are trans. However, Dr. Cass has explicitly stated that her work should not be used as an excuse to delay passing a ban. And I would argue that we must not delay any longer. And we cannot go into this election without passing such a ban because it would represent such a huge breach of trust. So I sincerely hope, and I feel slightly unfair targeting the Minister who is in his place with this because I know how supportive he is on this issue. But perhaps he could pass it back to those who might be less so, to urge them to get on with it. Because I do worry that this has become part of a wider targeting of the LGBT plus community, particularly the trans community, where they are becoming increasingly focused on as a group of people to erode protections in law. However, I worry that this is not only just the beginning. I'm pretty concerned, and I'm sure many of us are, that this targeting of LGBT plus people in an attempt to erode their rights is only the first step on a journey to erode many of our hard-fought rights, not just for LGBT plus people, but for many people across the UK. We are just seen as a convenient battering ram at the moment, and I really hope that we can come together and continue to fight against it. Because it's a fight that LGBT plus people didn't ask for. We want no part of. So I hope that in this election year, parties can commit to not using these issues as wedge issues and rather focus on the issues that actually matter to people. Otherwise, I fear that once the election has come and gone, we will be back here again asking for the same thing. So I really hope that the Minister, as much as I love seeing him and I love spending time with him, maybe we can cross out this date in our diary for next year so that we can make some progress and we don't have to bother him again and repeat ourselves. But to end on a happy note, Mr. Stringer, can I wish that everyone had a very happy LGBT History Month last month?
The question is that this House has considered LGBT History Month. Honourable members who wish to speak, if they, in the usual manner, can stand. Dame Angela Eagle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stringer, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship in a room that, for once, is actually warmer than it often manages to be, despite the temperatures outside. So clearly something is working better than it used to. With today's debate coming after LGBT History Month itself, I think due to sort of log jams in backbench business, it's probably an opportunity to celebrate the many events that have happened in the last month in schools, libraries, pubs, clubs, and across our country, because LGBT History Month is a huge ongoing event that has many, many different facets across the country. It's a time also for us to remember our past when we were, as my honourable friend, the co-chair of the APPG on global LGBT rights has just said, more hidden than we are now, to celebrate the present and some of the progress we've made, but also be, I will in a minute, let me just finish the sentence, but also be very, very clear-eyed about some of the potential problems we may be facing in the future. I'm happy to give way to my honourable.
Thank you, and can I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. She rightly highlights that although LGBT History Month was last month, its theme was really paying tribute to the contributions in the field of medicine and healthcare. And she may previously be aware that the Mayor of London has recently named one of the lines that go through my Battersea constituency, Mildmay, after the hospital that was playing a pivotal role in healthcare for those suffering under the HIV and AIDS epidemic. And in fact, it became Europe's first hospice for caring for people with AIDS-related illnesses. So does she agree with me that it is right that we recognise our history, also the progress being made, but highlighting the fight for equality and justice going forward?
I certainly do agree with...
We are absolutely not pushed for time this afternoon, and interventions should be brief and to the point. Dame Angela Eagle.
It's a great luxury not to be pushed for time these days in the House, and Mr. Stringer, you tempt me. But let's see how we go on. I particularly welcomed the Mayor of London's announcements about all the renaming of the overland train lines. After, I think, what are progressive causes, she mentioned one, and also a pretty fantastic football team, but you know, they have to keep proving themselves over and over again. So I think, as I was saying, it's a time to remember the past, but also be clear-eyed about some of the potential problems that face us as a global LGBT community, as well as in this country. And this debate gives us a chance to do that. LGBT plus History Month 2024 celebrated the community contributions to medicine and healthcare, as my honourable friend just mentioned in her intervention, and also highlighting the community's blighted history in getting access to healthcare. And there are the ignorance and prejudice and the inequality that came about as the AIDS pandemic, and it is a pandemic and it has killed millions of people, raged around the world, and all that we got was prejudice and ignorance. And the only thing that helped make any progress in amongst those grim times was the self-help that the community came together to provide in very, very many inspirational ways. Hopefully we are in more enlightened times now, although I have to say I have heard similar arguments made about the threat that LGBT people present resurfacing again in political discourse, more abroad than here, but rearing its ugly head on occasion here too. And I think that that is an alarm bell that we should all be listening to, and we should all be ready to fight. Because as my honourable friend says, the battle for equal rights and equality in the law, equal access to goods and services, being able to live a life that isn't blighted by prejudice or ignorance, or the fact that one is a particular thing, be it BAME, be it of a particular faith, be it LGBT. I think it's a really important thing. And when we fight together to improve the prospects of everyone who might be subjected to discrimination, we create a better, fairer, more equal society where people's human rights are properly recognised and where prejudice is pushed to the sides. So that is really what LGBT History Month is about, remembering. And it's also, I think, about teaching some of the younger members of our community who've breezed through life, never had to be in the closet, never been subjected to the kind of quite extraordinary vitriol that used to be a regular feature of the media in the 1980s. They don't really understand how far we've come and what gains had to be fought for and made, and they take it all for granted, which is fantastic, and I hope that they can continue to take it for granted. But I always think that if you don't know your history, then there's an increased chance that you'll have to repeat it. So I think it's an important time to reflect on the huge legislative progress that we made in campaigning for our rights and against prejudice, and the kind of progress that I thought was probably unimaginable when I was marching in the 1980s against Section 28. Some of us are old enough to remember Margaret Thatcher's conference speech in 1987, because I used to watch all of them. Used to watch all the conferences, TUC Congress as well. It used to be televised constantly then, and I was a bit of a junkie when it came to seeing what was happening. And I remember watching this speech where she decried that children were being cheated of a sound start to life due to the fact that they are taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. Well, it's not about a right to be gay, it's about being what you are and being able to live a life that is authentic to what you are, not having to hide away, not having to be berated for who you are, not being frightened to walk the streets. So we do remember the prejudice-laden tabloid coverage and the bullying that was involved in that, some of us who are old enough, the weaponisation of prejudice for electoral purposes that saw the enactment of Section 28, which made the lives of LGBT plus pupils and teachers at school a misery for generations. But gradually, in the face of often open media hostility, the last Labour government changed all that in a series of landmark changes to the legal statutes, which created a circumstance where largely LGBT plus people got their equal rights in law. Many of them were hard fought. It includes the 2000 Sexual Offences Amendment Act, which reduced the age of consent for gay and bisexual men to 16. Now, we had to put that act through Parliament 3 times and use the Parliament Act to get it onto the statute book because the Lords simply would not pass it. And we were then accused of, because we persisted with it, of being obsessed with buggery on the front page of the tabloids. And everything is created to make it look like you're the obsessive. You're the one that's trying to always go on about these things. There's no understanding that actually this is just a basic equality requirement that has to be there in law, or that person will be discriminated against, regarded differently, and treated differently. The world hasn't come to an end since we equalised the age of consent, despite some of the warnings. But it had to be really pushed. Similarly, the 2003 repeal of the Section 28, which many people here will remember, talked about pretend family relationships and ridiculed LGBT people and their relationships and their commitments to each other at a time when people could not get married or do any of the legal things that are available now. Again, that was another piece of legislation that it took us 3 years and persistence to finally repeal because the Lords wouldn't pass it. And every time we were nearly losing our local government bills, which had very many more, increasingly important things in them, we had to keep leaving it out and putting it in again, and it took 3 years to get that sorted out. We also had the landmark 2004 Gender Recognition Act, which enabled transgender adults to achieve legal recognition in their required gender. And that was because of important international court judgments, which basically said that they had a right to that. And I suspect that the fact that the Gender Recognition Act has been on the statute book for 20 years has passed quite a lot of people who've suddenly discovered that they're worried by transgender people But the fact is that transgender people weren't really visible at all until after the Act was passed. And it's an example of how our society gets kinder and more equal if people feel that they can present as they really are. And that is what, since then, transgender people have been doing until, for various reasons, it's become problematised in the last few years. So that was also put on the statute book. And we had the Civil Partnership Act, which established a new legal relationship for same-sex couples, which was then, some people say, upgraded. I don't, because I've still got a Civil Partnership Act and I haven't got married yet, partially because Mr. Stringer, the Catholic Church, doesn't recognise same-sex marriages, and my partner won't do it anywhere else. So, I mean, it's important also, I think, that we've recognised that civil partnerships can apply to heterosexual people too, because many people worry about the sort of baggage that comes with the chattelisation of women in a marriage. And I know many, many feminists who felt the same way, that are more than happy to have a civil partnership rather than a marriage in that sense. And so what we're doing is creating circumstances in society where people's loving relationships can be recognised, validated, and be made to be sound in law, so that there isn't a problem if somebody dies or is ill or needs to have an official connection as next of kin. And I think that that is really important. I'm going to also talk about the 2010 Equalities Act, which ensured that sexual orientation and gender reassignment became 2 of the 9 protected characteristics. I think it's a pretty good act. I know that there are various people who have problems with it at the moment, but I think it was very well balanced, piece of legislation that doesn't need change. And obviously we've got the 2013 Marriage Act, which legalised same-sex marriages too. And that was a time when my honourable friend, his party, realised that they'd got a bit left behind and they ought to come into the modern world. And the vast majority of them are still there, but not all of them, it seems, particularly after last Friday. But all this was thanks to having a progressive majority, a Labour government in that 97 to 2010 period, passing progressive legislation which made people's lives easier to live and demonstrated that their relationships, their loves, what they did in their life was properly respected. However, this progress hasn't been linear. Progress very rarely is. I can't think of anything where progress has been linear. And the community faces threats now, I think, that are reminiscent of what I hoped we'd left behind in the 1980s. For 4 consecutive years, between 2015 and 2019, the UK was ranked as the best place to be LGBTQ+ in Europe, in the Rainbow Europe Index, but we're now 17th. And there's been a cocktail of anti-LGBT hate crime out on the streets, and there have been anti-LGBT diatribes featuring increasingly in media and in some political discourse, and some members of the government trying to use that for their own purposes when it comes to modernising reform. Now, I don't point the finger at anyone in this room because I know that we are amongst friends in this debate, but there are some issues. On the basis of sexual orientation, police recorded hate crime in the past 5 years is up 112%. Against trans people, it's up 186%. In Merseyside, where my constituency of Wallasey is, reported hate crime based on sexual orientation is up 162%, and against trans people, it's up 1,033%. So let nobody say that the problematising of LGBT people, particularly trans people, doesn't have consequences on the street, because it does, and it's often very brutal consequences. So I think that what we need to do is try to marginalise the people who are thinking that a divisive war on woke is somehow the way that they can either win the next election, shore up the blue wall, do any of the things that they think they're doing by problematising particularly trans people, by painting them as a threat, by thinking that what happens on social media is somehow real, by thinking that the kind of provocations that go on there are anything other than that, and often generated by bots and agent provocateur outside of our own country in order to divide us. It's called hybrid war, and it's not something that we should indulge in. Now, I am disappointed, and I hope he might be able to cheer me up a bit later when he responds to the debate, but I'm disappointed that the Conservative government's dropped its LGBT plus action plan. And also dismissed its LGBT plus advisory board. Having those voices at the centre of where policy is made is always very, very important. And we know that the Equalities Minister has not seen any LGBT plus organisations except those that are gender critical in any of the meetings that she's had when she's trying to formulate government policy, and I think that is, to say the least, regrettable. I think that the problems at the moment around modernising the Gender Recognition Act and the manifesto promise to ban the abusive practice of conversion therapy need not have happened, but we are where we are, and we've got to try and find a way through. I think that there's been an authoritarian far-right backlash across the globe, evident across the world, which encompasses President Putin all the way to Steve Bannon, Trump's guru, with a lot in between. I think we have to see what's going on globally and connect it to how the trans issue has been seen as a wedge issue in order to take the T out of the LGBT and try to destroy progress in this area. Just last week we had honourable members lining up to stop a very mild private members' bill, which was actually so mild I wanted it to be toughened up considerably had it ever got to committee. But we couldn't even get it into committee, and nor would the government even allow an opinion, despite the sponsor bending over backwards to accompany, to try to create a situation where the bill could get into committee. We've had members of Parliament talking about LGBT people, which erases the T, equating conversion practices with families having a normal conversation about their children growing up and exploring ideas about themselves and their identity. That's not what a conversion practice is. It's easy to see torture and abuse when you see it, and torture and abuse is definitely not a conversation. So this year, whether the Prime Minister likes it or not, there'll be a general election, and Labour will offer the country to pick up legislating to protect the LGBT community with a comprehensive trans-inclusive ban on conversion therapy. I would have liked to get it done sooner. It will happen. We just have to make progress, and it's very sad that, as honourable friend said, it's taken longer than the Brexit negotiations, which makes you stop and think about quite what's been going on. We'll also strengthen the law so anti-LGBT plus hate crimes are treated as aggravated offences, which is and there'll be a much needed modernising of gender recognition processes, which are humiliating and overlong. So progress on LGBT rights around the world was summed up very well by my honourable friend in his opening remarks. But there are still 67 countries which criminalise homosexuality, 51 which restrict freedom of sexual and gender expression, and 11 which apply the death penalty for same-sex offences, including the two most recent pieces of legislation passed with capital punishment as part of the response in Uganda and in Ghana. Just last week, Ghana passed its promotion of proper human sexuality family values bill unanimously. I mean, just even think about the title. There's a whole load of assumptions in there that are interesting, to say the least. But it criminalises being gay. It prohibits adoption for gay people. It forcibly disbands all LGBT associations. For same-sex intercourse, one is likely to be jailed for up to 3 years. For producing, procuring or distributing material deemed to be promoting LGBT activities, it's 6 to 10 years. And for teaching children about LGBT activities, 6 to 10 years. Just yesterday on Ghana's Independence Day, protesters from LGBTQ plus Ghana Solidarity demonstrated outside Ghana's High Commission against this appalling bill. In Uganda, their Anti-Homosexuality Act passed last year. That includes the death penalty for the offence of aggravated homosexuality, whatever that is, life imprisonment for the offence of homosexuality, and up to 20 years in jail for promoting homosexuality. Now, a report compiled late last year by the Strategic Response Team, a coalition of Ugandan LGBT plus rights organisations, by the way, which have been criminalised for even existing in their own country and have to operate in very difficult circumstances indeed, found that between the Act becoming law in May and September, there had been 180 cases of evictions, 176 cases of torture, abuse and degrading treatment, and 159 incidents of discrimination. All of this was against both real and perceived LGBT plus people, because we have to remember that just because it's anti-LGBT plus legislation, it doesn't mean that the people that are caught by it are necessarily LGBT+. They are just marginalised or focused on for whatever reason the authorities feel that they wish to focus on them. We've heard the first person arrested and facing capital punishment under this law wasn't even gay. They were actually homeless, and they were found shirtless, arrested because they weren't wearing a shirt, because they were poor, and that's what they were charged with. The Ugandan authorities are using it to brutally criminalise the LGBT+ community, but also to go for any marginalised groups that they want to attack. It's one of those catch-all things that you can just put people in jail for. As is so often the case, an attack on one minority is only ever the beginning of attacks on many others. On our own European shores, over a fifth of countries lack broad protections for LGBT+ people. And again, my honourable friend mentioned this in his opening remarks. Discussions in schools on LGBT+ issues are outlawed in Russia, as is being LGBT, but outlawed in Hungary, Lithuania and Latvia. And in Poland, nearly 100 municipalities self-declared as LGBT-free zones. Now, I'm hoping that President Tusk, who's just, thank goodness, been elected in Poland, can start to undo some of the damage that the previous long-standing regime did in this area. In America, across the Atlantic, the Civil Liberties Union is currently tracking 474 anti-LGBTQ bills in state legislatures across the country. This is as of yesterday, but it's probably out of date already because several get promulgated every day. Florida's so-called Don't Say Gay law bans discussion on sexual orientation or gender identity in schools for children under 10. That's their very own Section 28. And this is being exported by Christian American groups who've ploughed more than $280 million into campaigning against LGBT+ rights and abortion rights worldwide between 2007 and 2020, targeting communities and parliaments around the world with their well-funded and coordinated doctrine of hate. The legislation in Uganda and Ghana is peculiarly similar because it was drafted in this kind of context. It's not arising spontaneously. It's actually being very well organised, and it has to be fought. And Britain, as a country that respects international human rights and has, I think, better standards than that, ought to be financing some of the battles to prevent the spread of this pernicious, very, very damaging ideology. Britain has to get back on the international stage to advance LGBT rights across the globe, and it has to support those who are campaigning to change these unacceptable laws at home. Now, I know the International Development Secretary is very aware of this, and we as an APPG have been to see him about it, and we certainly would want to, it'd be interesting if the Minister could say a bit about whether there's funding to help support a battle against these very, very worrying developments on the African continent. So, Mr. Stringer, we've made progress, we've stalled, we've progressed again, we're going forwards and backwards in a non-linear way, and there are challenges ahead. But we have to redouble our efforts, not only to be proud of who we are and proud of our communities, but to try and create a circumstance where, once more, Britain leads the world in LGBT+ rights.
Stephen Doherty.
Well, thank you, Mr. Stringer, and it's a pleasure to serve as your chairpersonship today, and a pleasure to follow two excellent speeches by the honourable and right honourable members. they've said many, many things that I agree with. I'm going to touch on a few of them in my remarks today, but also cover some other areas. And I too join everybody in belatedly wishing everybody a very happy LGBT plus History Month. It is very, very important, and particularly I want to thank the individuals who set this up many, many years ago as a point of focus, because I think it does allow us to reflect on where we were, where we've come and where we have to go, and also to look at all sorts of aspects of LGBT plus history within this country and indeed globally. And I, of course, declare my interest as a member of the all-party group on global LGBT rights and also as co-chair of the LGBT plus PLP with my honourable friend next to me. I think it is worth reflecting on the sort of the hard evidence of the positives of where we've come, Mr. Stringer. So if you look at the latest British Social Attitudes Survey report, which came out in September last year, details over the last 40 years many of the positive changes we've seen in attitudes. For example, in 1983, Mr. Stringer, only 17% of people believed that same-sex relations were not wrong at all. That's 67% today. And those who said same-sex relations were, and I quote, always wrong, has fallen from 50%. That was half of the population at the time, said it was always wrong, down to just 9% today. Now, that figure for me is still far too high, still amounting to nearly 1 in 10 people, but it does show you the progress that we have made as a result of campaigners, of activism, as a result of governments taking leadership and decisions on these issues. And indeed change within organisations that have previously also been extraordinarily considered themselves, including in parts of many of our faith communities. And I say that as a Christian. There's been, of course, huge changes within the church. Again, still not far enough for my liking, but certainly a lot of progress. And we have far many more inclusive places of worship and places of faith across this country than we did in the 1980s, for example. But it is important to reflect on the negative and where we're actually going backwards. And that same survey showed that since 2019, the proportion of people who describe themselves as, and I quote, not at all prejudiced against transgender people has actually fallen from 82% to 64%. That's just since 2019, in the last 5 years. So quite a rapid decline in support for and indeed awareness of and acceptance of those with transgender or indeed non-binary identity. And I think that should be a wake-up call and a worrying call to all of us, that we could have seen such changes in other aspects of rights, but such backsliding in just a few years. And I think it's already been reflected on, I think quite accurately, Mr. Stringer, a number of the reasons why we may have seen that to be the case in this country. And indeed, that hasn't happened in all countries across Europe or indeed globally. It is happening for a reason. Many of us have touched on it in debates in this place before, and it is deeply concerning and deeply worrying, not least when it's combined with some of the hate crime statistics and the very sharp and indeed violent, and in some cases tragically life-ending circumstances that we've heard debated in this place in recent weeks. I think it's also worth reflecting, and I don't say this any reflection on the two Conservative members who are here today, because I know that they are very, very strong advocates and indeed have bravely spoken out against challenges in their own party over recent years. But I think I'll always look back. I've got a poster on my phone, Mr. Stringer, that somebody once sent to me that was issued by Conservative Central Office in the 1980s in Smith Square, which literally has a picture of some people holding up banners in the street, and it says at the top of it, Labour camp, gay sports day, gay lib, do you want to live in it? Think about it, Conservative. Published proudly by Central Office, not by some activist or individual, published by the headquarters of the party in the 1980s. And I know that's not the party as it is today, and I know I sincerely hope that they would never publish that sort of material going forward, and certainly wouldn't be approved by the members in this room from the party. But I do really worry, Mr. Stringer, when we see some of the language, some of the divisive rhetoric from those who are perhaps auditioning to be a future Conservative leader, or indeed seek to take their party in a very, very different direction. Because I think one of the hallmarks of the work, certainly in our all-party group on global LGBT rights, rights, and indeed in many of the forums within this place and indeed within our own parties, is actually of people who, regardless of their huge divisions on other matters about how we might run this country, Mr. Stringer, are united on basic principles of human rights, of equality, of inclusion, and that we shouldn't have that kind of division, that kind of language, and that kind of problematisation of minority populations in this country. So I know that the two Conservatives here don't take that approach. They believe in an inclusive and an open party. But I think when we have senior figures standing up and saying some of the things they have done in recent weeks, we have a big problem in our country. And we know all too well within our own party when things are being done and said that are completely unacceptable, that takes bravery and that takes courage to speak up and stand up and be counted when it matters, even when it's on your own side. So I certainly hope we will see a pushback against that kind of language. Opposite, we don't want to go back to those days when the headquarters of the Conservative Party was putting out material like that. I wondered if I might, Mr. Stringer, to reflect a little bit on my own constituency, indeed, some of the fantastic organisations and groups not only in Cardiff South and Penarth, but also indeed in Cardiff and the Vale of Glamorgan, which I think are testament to the current vibrant LGBT plus inclusive communities we have, but have also been key in those shifts and those changes in social attitudes and behaviours over recent years. And I think particularly of Pride Cymru, which organises our annual Pride Parade in Cardiff, also our local prides. Over the last few years I've been able to attend a number of local prides in Wales, which simply wouldn't have happened when I was a young person growing up completely repressed and closeted in South Wales. Even in my own town where I went to school, Lantwick Major, which is in the neighbouring constituency of the Vale of Glamorgan, they held their own Lantwick Major Pride a little while ago. There was even an LGBT flag flying from the church. I literally could not have believed that as a child growing up in that town. Barry Pride, just down the road, I was proud to march there alongside many others. I went along to Newport Pride. Again, it would have been unthinkable a few decades ago. And of course, we all come together for the national celebration in Cardiff. And I really want to pay tribute to the volunteers and all the organisers who do such incredible work with Pride Cymru. And that, of course, draws on a history from the early days of the Mardi Gras in Cardiff right through to what we see today, which is a vibrant, inclusive, to all people, all ethnicities, all races, all religions, all ages festival of inclusivity. Indeed, a lot of fun, great music, and a great day out for all. So, those festivals, those coming together, I think have been key, and I think are also indicative of the progress that has been made. I also want to pay tribute to many of the key figures of the LGBT plus community, including some who have great historical knowledge and perspective. And I think of just two, Mr. String, today that I want to mention. One, my very good friend, indeed neighbour, and I declare an interest because she sometimes feeds my cat, but the wonderful Lisa Power, who was one of the original founders of Stonewall, one of the original operators on the LGBT plus switchboard, former director of policy at Terence Higgins Trust, but also herself a historian of the LGBT rights movement in the UK. She has written some fantastic books and articles, and she's also been part of a team researching LGBT plus history and lost venues and locations in Cardiff and Wales. And I think it's fantastic to be able to see how that heritage has developed over time. And also I think of people like Russell T Davies, who also a key figure on the scene, not only known for his work on Doctor Who and many other leading series, but of course critically the series It's a Sin, which I think showed very, very powerfully just a few years ago the remarkable struggles of those who were involved with the HIV campaigning and the wider LGBT plus campaigning, which was so critical at the time in the 1980s, and the very tragic circumstance of what many people went through. And it's by getting those stories to the screen, reminding people of what's happened, that we all, I think, can achieve progress going forward. So just two key people to mention from our local community. And of course, today we now see Cardiff and Vale of Glamorgan as a hub of not only excellent wider TV and film production, but also queer and LGBT inclusive TV and film production. And I think particularly of Doctor Who, filmed in my own constituency with BBC Studios, Bad Wolf and now Disney Plus, which has always had an inclusive approach to LGBT plus characters, increasingly so in recent times, and it was a real pleasure to join Shooty Cap at the premiere with the BBC just before Christmas. Many MPs go along to that, and a fantastic event. And also the famous series Sex Education on Netflix, filmed largely in my own constituency, which has become a worldwide hit, hugely popular, and again rooted in Cardiff and the Vale of Glamorgan, and indeed some of it's filmed in Newport too. I also want to pay tribute to our incredible venues locally. I mentioned the lost venues, but we're very, very lucky to have so many vibrant venues in Cardiff, indeed new ones opening up. Recently we had a new venue open, the Dock Feeder, just down from the new canal that's been opened in Cardiff, an uncovering of the old Dock Feeder canal, trying to do something similar to Manchester, not quite on that scale, but it's really positive to see. And also venues like the Golden Cross, which again I declare an interest to as a regular visitor, Mary's, Pulse, and so many others. These are the lifeblood of our LGBT plus communities, and I think it's really important that we recognise the role that venues have played in providing not only safe spaces and safe places for expression, but also for bringing together LGBT plus communities, particularly in the past when being so could have landed you in a lot of trouble or worse. And they still play a crucial role. It's important that we protect them and that we recognise those as safe spaces and welcoming spaces for the LGBT plus community. I think also of places like the Queer Emporium in the centre of Cardiff, which provides an awful lot of material and clothing, and again a safe place for people to meet. Of the wonderful LGBT plus societies that we have at our universities in Cardiff, organisations like Glitter Cymru, those that work with the BME communities in particular, and also of the work that's done by specific organisations working on issues not only affecting the LGBT plus community, but more broadly, but like Fast Track Cymru, that's doing work to end HIV transmissions and wider work around sexual health in South Wales. So I just wanted to touch on some of those because I think it's important that we recognise and celebrate not only what all those organisations have done in the past, but what they're doing today. I wanted to come to some of the issues which my honourable friends have already covered. Firstly, on conversion therapy, I share the sadness and concern and disappointment at the failure of the very reasonable bill that was put forward by the member for Brighton Kemptown not to progress in the House. And indeed, I'm afraid to say some of the quite divisive and unhelpful speeches that were heard during the course of that debate. The fact is, Mr Stringer, conversion therapy is abuse. It is a vile and abhorrent practice. I have met survivors of conversion therapy. I've known what damage it's done to them. I don't want to name individuals, but really harmful mental health impacts, self-harm, suicidal thoughts, a lifelong impact of forcing somebody to try and deny who they are. This practice needs to be stamped out. It's hugely disappointing that the government hasn't moved on this. I do hope the Minister will be able to say a little bit on that when he gets up, but deeply disappointing that the House didn't move forward that very reasonable bill. I am, however, very pleased that if a Labour government was elected, we have made clear that we would be implementing a fully inclusive ban on conversion therapy in all its forms. I think it's absolutely crucial we do this sooner rather than later. I'm astonished that this practice is still going on in this country in 2024, and it needs to be ended. We talked a little bit in the debate already about hate crime. I led a debate in this place, Mr Stringer, just a few months ago about hate crime, and we've heard some of the statistics. It was deeply disappointing that the Minister at the time used the word hysterical in referring to some of the comments that had been made in the debate. Now, this was a debate, Mr Stringer, that had members from all parties speaking up against hate crime in a non-partisan way, telling real stories that affected their constituents and other people up and down this country. I mean, the statistics bear it out for itself. And so then to have that kind of slightly dismissive response from a minister, it wasn't this minister, was deeply disappointing. And I hope the minister can reassure us that that's not the position of the government and that they do take hate crime seriously, because, as has been reported, we've seen an 11% increase in hate crimes against trans people in just a year, a 186% increase in hate crimes against trans people in the last 5 years. And although there was a slight fall in crimes against people on the basis of their sexuality last year, that is masked by a 112% increase in hate crimes in the last 5 years. And again, I'm sorry to have to declare an interest, Mr. Stringer, but I too myself have been a victim of a homophobically, an aspect of homophobic assault in my own constituency. I've also experienced online and other abuse, as I'm sure many other members have in this place. And it is a sad fact, Mr. Stringer, that these days, particularly those of us in public life, or indeed in the public eye more generally, and I think about people in all lines of work, journalists, public officials and others. If you are a woman, if you are black, if you are brown, if you are Jewish, if you're Muslim, if you are gay, if you are trans, if you're lesbian, the reality is that you will face a substantially higher level of abuse and I'm afraid to say risk as a result of your work, and that has to end and it has to stop. And quite frankly, social media companies and others need to be doing a lot more to crack down on this. But unfortunately, this is being fueled by rhetoric, by divisive rhetoric, and by language that is being used by some people who are in senior public positions, I'm afraid, Mr. Stringer, and that has a real-world effect on the ground. And we also know, and from the government's own reporting on this, Mr. Stringer, that they believe there is significant underreporting, and that they believe that fewer than 1 in 10 people who are victims of hate crime in this way are actually reporting. Now, I know that my own police force in South Wales take these matters very, very seriously, and I want to commend them for their work in this area. They don't get everything right, but they have certainly been very active and proactive on these issues. But again, that's not the case in all parts of the UK either, and trust levels in the police in some parts of the country are not what they should be, not least in the Metropolitan Police. And after some of the incidents in the past, we all know why that might be, Mr. Stringer. It's also been the case that, and I don't want to go into this too much because my shadow front bench role, but as we know, the global statistics on LGBT plus issues are of grave concern, not only in relation to the UK, which, as has been said, has fallen from 1st to 17th in that rainbow ranking since 2015, but also what we're seeing in a number of countries across Europe, indeed across Africa, and indeed globally, and that's before we mention places like Russia, China, and otherwise. You know, I share the great alarm at some of the recent developments, particularly that we've seen in countries in Africa. I think there are real questions to be asked. Were those worst fears to be realised in due course about not only the terrifying impact that's going to have on citizens in those countries, but also, quite frankly, I think people will be asking very serious questions about trade, investment. I think businesses will be asking questions about you know, where they choose to trade with, what sorts of relationships they choose to have, and indeed the safety and security of staff and others, or indeed tourists, or indeed members of this House travelling. I've travelled to one of those countries as part of a delegation. You know, I would certainly be thinking very carefully about my involvement in such a visit in the future if I thought that I was you know, being penalised for being who I am, or indeed at risk of jail or worse. So I think there are very, very serious questions that need to be considered. I certainly hope that those things don't come to pass in the way that they have been travelling at the moment, Mr. Stringer, and I do hope that it will think again. But our first and primary concern must always be for those who, just like in this country, exist, have always existed, should not be criminalised, should not be subject to the type of punishments and abuse that they do face, and indeed we need to make sure that we're always listening to those activists about the best ways in which we can work with, assist and empower them to go forward and to have their circumstances heard. As I said, there are indeed concerns in a number of countries across Europe as well. I regularly engage in these matters, and indeed across our UK overseas territories. We've seen many move forward in areas of inclusion and equality over the years, but there are some discrepancies, particularly with regard to equal marriage and civil partnerships and other rights for LGBT plus individuals. And you know, I firmly believe in the autonomy and devolution of responsibilities in our overseas territories, but also being part of the British family comes with responsibilities as well, and that includes the upholding of basic human rights and equalities. I wanted to end, really, Mr. Stringer, by just saying, as others have, that we are seeing very worrying backsliding. Progress clearly cannot be taken for granted. You only have to look at the very powerful book that our colleague, the Right Honourable Member for Rhondda, wrote about the experiences of members of this House, secretly gay members of this House, experienced in the relatively, for the time, permissive environment in Berlin in the 1930s, which then subsequently dramatically changed, and where it ended with LGBT people alongside, of course, 6 million Jews and Roma, Gypsies and others being taken to concentration camps. And, you know, I'm not suggesting that we're suddenly on the brink of that in this country, but I think we all have to learn from those terrible examples in history where progress, open-mindedness and inclusivity seem to be on the way, and then suddenly we're rapidly closed down. And we see this happening, of course, in a number of other countries. We still have far too much to do in this country, indeed. Even in this place, I'm pretty sure that if I asked Mr. Stringer to be married in a same-sex wedding in the Chapel of Mary Undercroft, I would not be permitted to do so, because it is, of course, an Anglican church. I might be lucky and be able to get a blessing now, but there's direct discrimination in this building against members of this House. I took the son of a young son of a friend around on a tour recently, and took them into the beautiful Chapel of Mary Undercroft, and I explained this, and the child said, the church is mean. And I said, well, I'm afraid they are on this, and I say that as a member of the church. You know, and the reality is that unless we see progress in all our institutions, in all parts of society, that fully respect and include every member of the society, regardless of their sexuality, their gender identity, or their other protected characteristics, then we still have a very long way to go. I'm very proud that our party has set out a number of very, very key commitments were we to form the next government. I know that we saw a very radical reforming Labour government in 1997 in this area, who did make huge changes, whether that was on Section 28 or civil partnerships or the GRA. I am very pleased by what my colleagues have been setting out regarding GRA modernisation, regarding a ban on conversion therapy, regarding aggravated offences on hate crime. I'm very pleased about what my Labour colleagues in Wales have been doing in terms of inclusive curriculum, in terms of an LGBT plus action plan, in terms of clear commitments to all in the community. That's the sort of society that we need to build, Mr. Stringer, society where everybody can be who they want to be, where we can all be who we want to be in this House too, Mr. Stringer. And that's why moments like LGBT History Month are so important.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the glass ceiling smashing honourable member for Wallasey and the honourable member for Carshalton and Wallington for calling this important debate and being visible and an inspiration to young LGBT plus people up and down the country. I was happy to support it when it was proposed as a backbench business debate, and thank the committee for allowing us time to discuss this important issue, because it's important that we continue to make LGBTQ plus people and the issues that affect us visible, and that we continue trying to build a world in which we are not only tolerated but celebrated for who we are. That seems truer now than it has in a long time. Now, I'm married to a Roman historian, so I could bore you all senseless on the LGBTQ plus history going back to the Roman times and much further, but I won't. Instead, focus on my short life instead. So I was born in March 1990, 3 years after the parliamentary debate on Section 28. In the decade before I was born, attitudes towards LGBTQ plus people had shifted dramatically. In 1983, as the member for Cardiff South and Penarth mentioned, 50% of those questioned by the British Social Attitude Survey believed that sexual relations between two adults of the same sex were always wrong. But by 1987, that proportion had risen to 64%. In the years immediately before I was born, the horrifying truth is that the society had become less tolerant of LGBTQ plus people. That's frightening because it shows that attitudes don't automatically become more progressive over time. The shift in opinion didn't fall out of the sky. It was driven by the debate on Section 28, and a Prime Minister who the member for Wallasey has already mentioned said that no one has an inalienable right to be gay. But in the years that followed, my entry into the world, things began to change. Whilst I attended secondary school, at the age of 13, Section 28 was repealed, and new rights for trans people had been enshrined in law, as has been mentioned. In the decade that followed that, as I grew up, I could see a wave of legislation affirming the rights of LGBTQ plus people. And I'm so proud to be here as a Member of Parliament for the party that brought in so much of that legislation. And it's accumulation of those things that led me to the firm belief that you absolutely do have an inalienable right to be gay. And I'm not alone. Where once 64% of people thought same-sex relationships were always wrong, now 67% of people believe they are never wrong. And that's why now is a frightening time for people like me, because I grew up under progress, and now, for the first time since I've been alive, that progress is not only stalling, it feels like it is going backwards, and backwards quickly. It was only in 2018 that the then Minister for Women and Equalities told the House that trans men are men and trans women are women. Obviously, things have changed, and not for the better since then. Now you are more likely to hear a joke at the expense of trans people from the dispatch box than an affirmation of their identity. Despite the lessons we should have learned from Section 28 and the damage it did, we are still haunted by the premise that some people do not have the inalienable right to be who they are. That has consequences. As has been mentioned, hate crime against trans people went up 11% last year, nearly doubling those committed in 2020 to 2021. It also has consequences for the wider community. In the previous year, we've seen far-right and fascist pickets outside LGBTQ plus events, and while there's been a reduction of hate crime directed to LGBTQ plus people in the last year, I think that probably has more to do with reporting. If we look back for 2 years, there's been an overall increase of 37.5%. And anecdotally, I know that people are feeling much less safe. Britain is part of a pattern. Across the United States, we've seen shootings at LGBTQ plus venues, alongside legislative attacks on queer culture and performance spaces. In Poland, anti-LGBTQ plus zones that ban symbols like pride progress flags that show a place is safe for queer people has now been banned, making it harder for people to live freely and in supportive spaces. In Hungary, Section 28 style laws that ban the depiction of LGBTQ plus people in culture are causing havoc. And in Australia, fascists are marching to strip trans people of their rights. And in Italy, Giorgia Meloni's post-fascist party have banned municipal authorities from registering the children of same-sex couples. How have we got here? Our steps towards progress, both domestically and internationally, are faltering, and we are being pushed backwards. But I also have hope. 3 years before I was born, more people than not thought that being gay was morally wrong. Now attitudes have changed. To turn the tide, we must learn the lessons, to support and celebrate people, not force them into the closet, to treat people with dignity and respect, not as objects of fear or ridicule, and whatever anyone may say, to insist on their inalienable right to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, queer, or every other identity represented by the Pride Progress flag.
Thank you very much, Mr Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I'm very grateful to the honourable members for Carshalton and Wallington and for Wallasey for their leadership in the debate today. And it is a pleasure to speak in the annual LGBT plus History Month debate and to reflect on the journey that's been made and also on where change still, or change now, needs to come. I do welcome the opportunity to speak about the positive progress that we see in a whole range of areas, but as the honourable member for Carshalton and Wallington pointed out, there is no inevitability about progressive change, and we can all see this playing out. We can see the statistics showing hate crimes against LGBT people rising, and we need to be prepared here to speak out and to speak up for the rights of LGBT plus people. It's quite extraordinary to me to think that it was only 10 years ago that same-sex couples were allowed to marry, and that only coming 10 years after civil partnerships were introduced, which same-sex couples could enter into. It is almost inconceivable to me that these changes that I think are so overwhelmingly accepted as part and parcel of partnership and marriage were made so very recently. I think the Honourable Member for Sheffield Hallam put it very well when she called for us not just to tolerate but to celebrate LGBT plus communities. And it's true, we have come a long way in relatively recent times, obviously playing catch up because change was well overdue by then, and it's beyond time for further change. Change like a ban on conversion practices, which we've heard so much about today. The SNP Scottish Government is very clear on the need to act to end conversion practices and make sure that everyone, regardless of their identity, is protected from them. This is progress that we need to see all across these islands. And I'm very sorry I wasn't able to join the Honourable Member for Brighton Kemptown last week for his private member's bill, but I did see enough to think that unfortunately this place didn't come away looking particularly good. And we do need to be able to discuss and listen to others without some of the heat that seems to be inevitable at the moment. And unfortunately that heat is to some extent ramped up by the U-turning and stopping and starting and obfuscation which this government, not this minister, but this government has engaged in on this topic. And also by the desire in some quarters to polarise, to demonise, or to do what the Honourable Member for Wallasey described as problematising. It's clearly a direction of travel that's mirrored by and influenced by increasing populism and division in countries across the globe. But we don't need to do that. We don't need to accept that as inevitable. Nobody benefits from it. No communities benefit from it. And it causes such significant worry and harm to LGBT communities. And with good reason that worry exists when we look at these statistics. Hate crimes based on sexual orientation reportedly up 112% from 5 years ago. Hate crimes against trans people up 186% over that same period. And I was struck by the Law Commission's hate crime report that says members of governments and legislatures across the UK should not engage in culture war targeting of the trans community or use their positions to stir fear and hostility towards trans people. All governments across the UK should commit to addressing the causes of rising LGBT plus hate crimes. It's difficult to argue with that, surely. And it's really important amidst all of this conversation that we do our best to make sure that young people are provided with constructive and inclusive education. I'm always really proud to stand here and talk about the exceptional work which the TIE campaign has done to deliver that inclusive education in Scottish schools. As a mum, that's important and welcome to me. And I know that my views are actually shared by the vast majority of parents. A recent survey found that 70% of parents support this national LGBT plus inclusive education programme. And I've said before that this is a far cry from my own school days, and it was interesting to hear the Honourable Member for Cardiff and Penarth South reflect on his school days. It was admittedly not yesterday that I was at school, but it was really clear to me then that no child in my school was LGBT+. It was a perfectly good school that I went to, a perfectly nice school. But I was at school in the 1980s when Section 28 was big news. And the Honourable Member for Wallasey spoke very powerfully about the hugely difficult times in the 1980s and the terrible impact that had on people. And I also looked back to what was being said at that time, and it's very easy to see why people felt that they should keep their identities hidden. Margaret Thatcher, in her Conservative Party conference speech in 1986, said that children were being cheated out of a sound start in life due to being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. It's actually quite hard to read and say that now. And obviously, the thing is, of course, gay people have got an inalienable right to be gay because they are gay. And in my school, of course, the truth was that many pupils were gay. There were LGBT plus pupils in the school. It's just that they felt the need to keep that to themselves and move on in their lives and move on in time before making that known. So we can't go backwards to times when it was some kind of taboo. How can it be a taboo to be yourself? And I do think that the attitudes of young people actually will be instrumental in making sure that that rowing back, which some people would unfortunately like to see, will not happen. And I wanted to mention today someone who I think is a real inspiration to these young people, but to some of us who are a bit older as well, someone who's a change maker and very much to be admired. In September 2022, Xander Murray came out as the first senior Scottish footballer to come out as gay. He currently plays for Bonnyrigg Rose, which is a Scottish professional football league club in League Two. He is a bit of a goal-scoring machine. and he's now the first openly gay player in Scottish football since Justin Fashanu. And since he's come out, Xander has been really passionate and really committed to being a role model to the sporting community, to empowering young people, particularly footballers, to be their true, authentic selves. And I think that that's incredibly powerful and incredibly important. I'm going to quote Xander, and he said, "Whilst growing up, unfortunately, I felt that my life in football and my sexuality could not coexist. I felt that I needed to keep it hidden and fight against it for years, which resulted in numerous missed opportunities and internal struggle. Fortunately, I am now at peace with myself, and more importantly, I have found an amazing community that I want to stand up for and be an active ally for. It is now really important that I play my part to ensure no one experiences what I did, and that all young LGBT plus people know that football and that any other sport is a place where they can thrive." Surely a sentiment that all of us would agree with. And Xander is clearly making a huge difference. I know that he is retiring at the end of this season, and I've no doubt that he will continue to make a positive difference and continue to be a really important voice in this conversation. And that conversation is one that we really all need to engage in a great deal more, not just the people in this chamber who I know engage in this conversation with goodwill and with enthusiasm at all times, but a much broader conversation which people like Xander will be able to inspire others to take part in. Thank you, Mr. Stringer.
Ashley Dalton.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairpersonship. And I congratulate the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington and the Right Honourable Member for Wallasey for securing this important debate today. And I thank them both for their efforts in doing so. Have I done something wrong?
No, I was just saying I'm not right now.
Oh, I assumed you were. Oh, yeah. The Honourable Member. Apologies. LGBT History Month is an opportunity for us to look back and remember what we have achieved. And the Honourable Member for Wallasey highlighted that LGBT History Month is that opportunity to know our history so that we might be less likely to repeat its mistakes. And she also pointed out that the government's LGBT Action Plan and Advisory Board are now things of LGBT history, perhaps not the kind of history that we would want. And as the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington pointed out, LGBT people have been around for time immemorial. We're not new. But we are still debating LGBT rights on at least an annual basis, and we must be ever vigilant about how fragile the rights that we do have can be. But it's also an opportunity to reflect on the current state of LGBT plus rights, both at home and overseas. And there is much to celebrate. I'm delighted that same-sex couples can finally receive at least a blessing from the Church of England. Religion and religious expression is as intrinsic to the identity of some people as sexuality. And the fact that same-sex relationships can now be recognised by the Church of England is a long-awaited milestone for the LGBT plus community, and one which we all hope will be followed by more progress in this area in the years to come. I was also pleased to see that the government took the decision last summer to expand the scheme to pardon people who served in the military and were convicted of homosexual activity. This includes allowing female veterans to wipe their offences from the record. Sexuality is not a crime, as the last Labour government recognised when it first lifted the ban on LGBT plus people serving in the armed forces in 2000. I'm glad that the government issued an apology to all LGBT plus personnel impacted by the ban. It is a step in the right direction, but we are still waiting for news on the progress of financial reparations and other recommendations in the independent review. And I wonder if the Minister could provide an update on that today. In Europe, there have also been several advancements in LGBT plus rights that are worth highlighting. While Greece became the first Orthodox Christian country to legalise same-sex marriage in February, Latvia will join its neighbour Estonia in legalising same-sex marriage this year. Several European states, including Norway, Portugal, Cyprus, Ireland and Belgium, have also achieved what this country currently has so far failed to, in passing bans on so-called conversion therapy across their nations. It is with much disappointment that I today mark LGBT plus History Month in this House with no ban on conversion practices on our statute book. However, the international picture on LGBT plus rights is far more mixed. Across the globe, LGBT plus individuals remain criminalised, persecuted and at risk of death. Last month, Russia began enforcing new legislation which has criminalised the display of extremist symbols such as the pride flag. In St Vincent and the Grenadines, courts upheld laws criminalising gay sex last month, while in Uganda, as has been noted, merely identifying as LGBT was criminalised in 2023. And in some nations where the legal system may not directly persecute or diminish the rights of LGBT plus people, societal attitudes may. In South Africa, which remains the only nation in Africa where same-sex marriage is legal, still 59% of South Africans oppose same-sex marriage. Similarly, a minority of the Greek public supported gay marriage when polled late last year. These figures act as a stark reminder that while legal progress may have been made, the LGBT plus community continue to face the same or similar attitudes that once legally prohibited the free expression of our sexuality. The Honourable Member for Battersea, who's no longer in her place, raised the recent recognition of Mildmay Hospital in the renaming of London Underground lines and its deep connection with the LGBT communities through its provision of services to those affected by HIV and AIDS, particularly at a time where prejudice was rife, even in our NHS. And also, at home, last summer marked a decade since same-sex marriages were introduced in this country, a significant moment in the LGBT plus community. But many LGBT plus people won't feel able to celebrate this anniversary, because whilst news that anti-LGBT plus hate crimes have fallen 5% over the past year, and that is welcome, hate crimes motivated by transphobia have increased by 11% over the same time. And the rate of violent hate crimes targeting all groups has not fallen. The importance, the Honourable Member for Cardiff South and Penrith mentioned the importance of venues in providing safe places for LGBT people to meet, to congregate, to socialise, to network and build a community. And moving on from that, the Honourable Member for East Renfrewshire also highlighted the importance of role models, particularly in sport and popular culture, for young people who are LGBT, and I would argue also for those that are not. But too many members of the LGBTQ plus community now still do not feel able to be who they are in public, hiding their identity or their sexuality. And the statistics on anti-LGBT hate crime don't even tell half the story, because the government's own figures acknowledge that 90% of anti-LGBT hate crime goes unreported. It is the responsibility of us all in this place to ensure that we make our country a safer place for LGBT plus people. Last week, we had an opportunity in Parliament to start the ball rolling on an inclusive ban on conversion practices. I'm glad to see the Minister here today for this debate. I know that he has personally been very supportive of a ban, and it was therefore a shame he couldn't be in the chamber last Friday. The Honourable Member for Cardiff South and Penrith also told us about the large and rapid decrease in people saying they are not prejudiced against trans people. And we have to consider how the language and the leadership, or lack of it, shown on the government benches might be contributing to that. The Honourable Member for Sheffield Hallam also reminded us that the shift in public opinion in the late 1980s, away from general support to hold more negative views of LGBT people and same-sex relationships, was in the context of the Section 28 debate. A reminder that progress is not inevitable and that we can go backwards as well as forwards. It appears still that the government has no immediate plans to bring a ban to the House. Could the Minister confirm whether or not he supported last Friday's bill? The government may choose to sit on its draft conversion therapy bill for fear of unleashing a backbench rebellion that could bring down the Prime Minister. But Labour has a proud record of leading the way on LGBT plus rights. And it was Labour that repealed the appalling Section 28, Labour that introduced civil partnerships, paving the way for equal marriage, Labour that ended the ban on LGBT plus people serving in our armed forces, Labour that equalised the age of consent, Labour that gave LGBT plus couples the right to adopt, Labour that introduced the Equality Act, Labour that made homophobia a hate crime, and Labour that brought forward the Gender Recognition Act. All of that achieved by the last Labour government. A record that made our country a safer and more hospitable place for LGBT plus people to grow up, to work, to love and to thrive. And the next Labour government will continue that work. It's Labour who will legislate to give longer sentences to criminals found guilty of LGBT plus motivated hate crimes. It's Labour who will deliver a new deal for workers that tackles workplace harassment of LGBT plus people. And it's Labour that will put a full, loopholes-free, trans-inclusive ban on conversion practices on the statute books. It's Labour who will always treat LGBT plus people fairly, with dignity, respect, and crucially, equality.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Stringer, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. And can I also add my thanks to the honourable members for Carshalton and Wallington and for Wallasey for securing this debate. And it is an important debate for so many reasons, because for too long the history of LGBT people's lives, their stories and their love were hidden. The achievements that people carried out, the advancements and the breakthroughs that people made were recorded but never acknowledged or celebrated, and this is simply because they were LGBT. We've had some really thoughtful contributions this afternoon. My honourable friend opening the debate rightly talked about the international changes that have happened, some good, some really very, very worrying indeed, and that how we cannot take progress for granted, which the honourable lady from Wallasey agreed, and remind us that we need to be mindful of the risks that do exist, and that actually by fighting together we can make sure that progress continues to be made. The honourable member for Cardiff South and Penarth talked about pride events in Wales and the difference that things are like today in villages. Well, as someone who grew up on the Isle of Anglesey back in the 70s and 80s, I remember if you wanted to go to a gay club, you had to travel miles on the first Monday of the month to Llandudno. But it really was interesting to hear. I think one of the most shocking things I heard, though, was that the honourable member, the member for Sheffield Hallam, was born in 1990, making me feel incredibly old this afternoon. As the honourable member for Wallasey said, as LGBT people, it is important for us to remember our past and understand it, and to celebrate our present and create our future. And these are the principles of LGBT History Month, and those are the principles in which I know I and many people here am proud to stand on today in a house which is made up of more LGBT people than ever before. And rightly, we've remembered many of the battles for rights that have happened, and that persistence was often the way that ensured that happened, whether it be Section 28, the GRC, the age of consent, or equal marriage. The quote in the Honourable Lady's speech that the sky didn't fall in was very, very true indeed. In fact, I remember after the equal marriage debate, people were very quickly boasting that they'd been to a gay wedding and celebrating that fact. The theme for LGBT History Month this year is celebrating the contributions made by LGBT people to the fields of medicine and healthcare, and it asks us to look under the scope and recognise the invaluable contributions of LGBT people across the medical and healthcare sectors, including in our world-renowned NHS, that have often been overlooked. And so for a moment, I do want to reflect on that. The UK has long been known for trailblazing healthcare professionals, and I'm proud that today this debate gives me a chance to pay tribute to some of those who were LGBT. Dr. Sophia Jex-Blake, a 19th century Scottish physician, most widely known as Scotland's first ever practising female doctor, and for her pivotal role as a member of the Edinburgh Seven. Sophia devoted her life to the advancement of women's rights in the field of medicine and helped lead the campaign to secure women's access to university education. And after qualifying as a doctor, she helped found 2 medical schools for women in both London and Edinburgh, and this was during a time when medical schools were only training men. She retired to Sussex in 1899, where she moved in with fellow physician Dr. Margaret Todd, of whom many believe was her partner. Sophia was never openly a lesbian. Upon her death, though, Margaret published Sophia's private musings, many of which confessed her love for women. Another extraordinary and hidden story is the life of C. Ewan Forbes. On the surface, his life might appear as one of generosity. Born into an aristocratic family in Aberdeenshire, Ewan graduated as a doctor in his early 30s and began practising as a local GP. Not long after this, he married his wife, Isabella Mitchell. From a young age, Ewan was open about his transgender identity, at a time when being trans wasn't understood and certainly wasn't socially acceptable. And although registered female at birth, Ewan recognised that his legal sex was not his true self, and with the support of his family was believed to have undergone pioneering gender-affirming care. And upon marrying his wife, sought to make the marriage legal by seeking legal gender recognition in 1952. Although a taboo topic at the time, it was relatively smoothly awarded upon that request. However, his legal recognition was later questioned when his older brother died and he was set to inherit the fortune and become a baron. This was something that at the time was seen as scandalous, as many did not accept the legal gender, and he took it to the Scottish Court of Session and won. Despite the case being conducted in secrecy, it marked a pivotal moment in transgender rights. The fascinating details of his life were recently recorded in a book, The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes, which I must say is a much recommended read. But as others have done today, we shouldn't just be thinking about the past, but also the future, and it gives me an opportunity, and the present day, to pay tribute to my colleague, Dr. Michael Brady. Michael is a sexual health and HIV consultant at King's College Hospital, as well as NHS England's first ever national advisor for LGBT health, where he leads work to tackle health inequalities faced by the LGBT community. He's long worked for better healthcare for LGBT people, and alongside his role as the National LGBT Health Advisor, he spent 15 years as the medical director at the Terence Higgins Trust and played a huge role in advocating the national rollout of PrEP, the HIV prevention drug. And he's someone that consistently strives to improve healthcare provision and outcomes for LGBT people in his everyday role. And I pay tribute to all the others that we could probably mention under the theme of LGBT History Month. But coming on to some of the other points that people have raised today, internationally, I absolutely recognise some of the great strides that many countries have made, and colleagues have made very important points, but clearly there are some awful things still happening. As many have mentioned, the laws in Uganda, Ghana, Hungary and Russia are all extremely concerning. And I'd like to assure members of this House that as a government we continue to raise these issues whenever we have those opportunities. The FCDO now has a new 5-year £40 million LGBT rights programme, and this programme will hopefully transform the lives of millions of LGBT people around the world by reducing the violence and discrimination that people have experienced, and also offering support to those who are campaigning very, very bravely sometimes in very hostile environments. I'll happily give way to the Honourable Lady.
giving way, and I'm interested in what he's saying about the situation in different countries overseas. I wonder what his reflections are on the situation for LGBT plus people in Rwanda, and whether he's able to tell us what his thoughts are in relation to his government's plans there.
Well, my view is very clear that wherever there are challenges for LGBT people, we have a duty to raise those at every point. That's not just in Rwanda. There are lots of other countries in which we have lots of different agreements, and it's important that we raise those even when they're good friends of ours, where we think that they're making decisions that are really not in the best interests of the community that we all want to see and help and support. Of course.
And I just wonder if I can, through this intervention, pay tribute actually to the FCDO's work in that area. I was invited by the British Embassy in Prague to go and speak with our sister party and parliamentarians in Czechia last year to persuade them that the sky wouldn't fall in if they passed equal marriage. So can I please pay tribute through him to the work that our officials are doing internationally in that regard?
I absolutely agree with him. I think that is exactly the opportunity that our colleagues in FCDO do, and help us to provide those opportunities to share our experiences of, yes, there are challenges when you're bringing through these pieces of legislation, when you're bringing these reforms. You do get I remember all those emails coming in when we were having the equal marriage debate. But as I say, the next day, as the Honourable Lady said, the sky hadn't fallen in, and actually most people can't even believe that 10 years ago you couldn't get married. I think that's what we need to do, to spread the gospel, as it were. The Honourable Lady Wallasey also mentioned how far we've come around the area of HIV and AIDS. And I think, given the topic of this year's History Month, it's important to talk about that. And as she rightly said, I think we're all aware of the scars the HIV and AIDS crisis left on so many in the LGBT community, not just for them, but their friends and their family. And sadly, we lost far too many. Now, thanks to the advancement of medicine, HIV is a preventable and treatable condition, and a condition that is no longer seen as a death sentence in the way that it once was, and instead something which is easily manageable and allows people to live long, happy lives post-diagnosis. And that is why I'm pleased that we have committed to investing more than £4.5 million in our national prevention programme, and committed to ending new HIV transmissions, AIDS and HIV-related deaths within England by 2030. It is an ambitious target, but we are on target and on course for it. And great progress has already been made here through our National HIV Action Plan. NHS England have committed £20 million to expand the opt-out HIV testing in emergency departments in local areas with the highest prevalence of HIV levels. And that has helped to identify more than 1,000 people with untreated or undiagnosed HIV in the first 21 months, which I think is truly fantastic. But the message still needs to be that people need to just keep testing, because the sooner you are diagnosed, the sooner the treatment can be given to you, and you can live that happy and normal life. Moving on to the issue of conversion practices, the favourite part for me. I think honourable members will know my personal views on this, and I'm pleased to say that I think there is consensus by the vast majority that no one in this country should be harmed or harassed for who they are, and that extends to the threat of conversion practices. And I want to make it clear that attempts at so-called conversion therapy are abhorrent, and in order to stand up for people, LGBT people, it's key that we end any practice that falsely claims to cure or change a person's identity. And we're clear on our stance that such practices are harmful and simply do not work. and that is why we are still committed to publishing a draft bill on this topic for pre-legislative scrutiny soon. This will include targeting efforts to change someone from or to being transgender. It is a sensitive area and one of great debate. I've always wanted to do this, but even I have recognised that there are challenges. I have to be honest about that. And I do pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Brighton Kemp Town for the considered way he presented his bill. I'm sorry that I was not there. I was at a ministerial meeting up in Glasgow. But as I say, I recognise the considerable effort he took in drafting that bill. And I know that he did that with criticism from both sides of the argument as it happened. But government still wants to introduce its own bill, and that's why there was that decision to oppose. The government has rightly taken time to carefully consider these and ensure our bill is as robust as possible. And moreover, it is right and proper that the government puts it for pre-leg scrutiny so that we can have a further safeguard, making sure that it does what we are expecting it to do. But in the meantime, I'm keen to remind the House that the government funds a victim support service run by the anti-violence charity Gallup, and this does enable those at risk of or undergoing conversion practices to report their situation and access tailored support and guidance. And I keep repeating that because I want people to know that there is somewhere that they can go to get help should they need it. Of course.
I know how difficult it is as a minister to get the entire government to agree to do what you want them to do when you want them to do it. But there has been, that formulation of words has been used many, many times, and we're coming to the end of the Parliament now. Can you give us even a hint of whether this thing is going to appear at all, or are we going to have to wait until after the general election?
As I said, it is our intention to publish. I can't give a specific date, and she helpfully outlined some of the challenges she sometimes faces as a minister, but I can assure her that it is the intention to publish for that scrutiny. But I have equally heard the message that my honourable friend and others have said, and I will certainly relay that on. Coming to the issue that all members also have mentioned on the issue of violence and hate crime, I think this is incredibly important. We are aware that sadly many LGBT people in the UK and across the world still experience violence and discrimination just because of who they are. The sentencing following the horrific murder of Brianna Gay recognised that her death was caused in part because of hostility towards her transgender identity. And once again, I send my condolences to her family and hope that no other families have to endure what that family has had to go through. We do expect the police to prosecute the perpetrators of violence and for the courts to consider the aggravating factors when determining sentences in line with our hate crime legislation. And there is more that we have been doing to tackle hate crime head on. We've made hate crime a priority offence in the Online Safety Act, and under new legal duties of care, technology companies must prevent, identify and remove illegal content and activity online. And this means that less illegal content, including content that incites hate on the grounds of race, religion or sexual orientation, when it does appear, will be removed quickly. But I recognise that this is still a worrying time, and since those attacks that we saw a lot of in the summer last year, I've made it a priority to meet with those certainly in the Met Police and others to see what more, or to understand what they're doing, to make the reporting of crimes a process that feels like they're being supported and that they're not being the ones grilled. See what I mean? I do think that's really important. So I want to end today by sharing how proud I am to stand in this House, to represent my constituency and hold my ministerial positions as an openly gay man. And we must remind ourselves how far we have come in progressing LGBT rights, but also remember that we have some way to go. The Honourable Lady referred to the footballer Xander Murray, and you know, as the sports minister, I'm acutely aware that for many in the LGBT community, sport can sometimes feel an intimidating place to go, and that's why, as part of our strategy, making it more inclusive, more welcoming is something that I've put as a personal priority. And I hope that we can all take away from today the importance that comes with remembering all those who came before us, all of the LGBT people that made great contributions to the world around them, but were sadly forced to hide who they truly were never accepted, or were even persecuted for their true identity. And looking forward and looking ahead, I look forward to seeing the invaluable contributions of LGBT people that we are yet to see. If this year's theme shows us anything, it's that LGBT people can make changes that better the lives of all of us. Thank you.
Elliot Colburn to wind up.
Thank you, Mr. Robertson. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship at the end of this debate. And can I thank all participants, but particularly the member for Wallasey, my co-chair. Just assumed that she must have been a right honourable. But I'm incredibly grateful for her friendship and her diligent work in this area as we co-chair this APPG. I've been very lucky to share that privilege with her, and it's been great for us to bring this to the House again today. I don't want to make the Minister feel even older, but just building on the point that the member for Wallasey said, I think it's important to end on when she said that younger people have maybe taken their right, younger LGBT plus people maybe have taken their rights for granted. And as someone who was born in 1992, apologies to the member for Sheffield Hallam, I do think that can sometimes be true. I'm glad to say it. I was very lucky. My school was very progressive in that sense of I had a very great childhood and didn't necessarily come up against some of the barriers that those that came before us did. But I think it is important that we must remember that we should still continue to fight together, because if we allow them to remove the trans away from the rest of the LGBT community, they will be coming after us next. And if we allow them to come after us next, you can be sure they'll be going after women's reproductive rights and other human rights as well. We know that these things are intertwined, and it's all heading in the same direction, which is the eradication of certain hard-fought-won rights. But I'm grateful to the Minister for his considered response. I know in him we have a friend as the government's chief gay, as it were. So I appreciate him taking the time to respond to this debate today. On that basis, Mr. Robertson, I beg to move the motion.
The question is that this House has considered LGBT History Month. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The sitting stands adjourned. Order. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.